Welcome back to How Should I Introduce You? I am Silas Grant here again for another installment of conversations between people that I know, but they don't know one another. As I've been looking through my contacts, I have been trying to find what I feel to be good connections and also connections that will lead to good conversations and conversations that could potentially change the world for the better. And the two people that are joining me today are doing great work in their own right. And I felt that it was a good thing to make an effort to connect the two of them to have a conversation about a host of things. I'm joined by Jioni Palmer as well as Shauntia White, two phenomenal people doing selfless work. And, again, I think connecting people like this is really, really important. The way I start this thing is typically I talk a little bit about each of them and then we go right into it. So I'll start with Jioni. And he sent me some things about himself. And he talked about as far back as the 7th grade in Willard Jr. High School. He started in the media business and he founded the school paper. And his first piece was about a kid in school, the only kid in school who could dunk a basketball. And a year later, he ended up creating the Willard Olympics, which was a school-wide, week-long sporting event where students competed in a bevy of activities from handball to wrestling. In high school and in college, he wrote and edited campus publications. UCLA, his professional career began in media, and he began writing news and entertainment pieces for Rap Pages magazine. He went on from there to cover sewers in LA, landfills on Long Island, the devastation and rebuilding of New Orleans, power politics on Capitol Hill, and the presidential campaign trail. For much of the past decade, Jioni has worked for members of Congress and the Obama administration as a communication strategist and coalition builder. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, his 2 sons, and their 2 cats. So that is Jioni.
And we have a puppy now, too, as a matter of fact. Eight weeks old.
All right, I've got to update the bio.
I know, but I sent it to you. He wasn't with us.
Yeah. So Shauntia White is the founder of Wise Social Work, Inc. It's a progressive network of social workers and allies creating social change in human services through advocacy, organizing, and fundraising among adolescents and young adults globally who have experienced trauma or are interested in social work application in entrepreneurship. The organization is looking to partner with corporations, government, and other nonprofits that share Wise Social Work's commitment to advancing youth and young adults in rewarding social work careers and other entrepreneurial endeavors. So Shauntia, welcome to How Should I Introduce
You?
Good stuff. Both of you have large, long visions for your respective organizations. But in recent times, you both have been hyper-focused on immediate concerns with social justice issues of the current times. What's pushed you all to zoom in to the happenings of right now?
So what really moved me to participate in what's happening right now is just one thing I didn't share with you earlier is my mom died of a drug overdose in DC, literally hours after her release from St. Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. It's just a lot of what's going on in DC reminds me of some of the global issues that go on in society. My mom was criminalized. She was charged with a whole litany of things, including resisting of arrest. And so, she also experienced brutality for someone who had an addiction by Metropolitan Police. And so these are some of the reasons why I stay close and connected with Silas on the work that you do on a personal and professional level, is because my family is still touched by the work that used to be done on the level of social services. I was actually born in Southeast Hospital when it was Southeast Hospital. So much of myself is still rooted in DC, even though I was raised in Prince George's County. My family is a fourth or fifth fifth, but it's, I know for sure, fourth generation Washingtonian and seventh generation Prince Georgian. So my lineage goes all the way back to the 1920s in DC. And so I don't want to lose sight on what's going on there. But then the nationally, what's happening, it's just, we really need to address issues of our family and issues of our people, and how, unfortunately, social services has created a pathway for police officers to respond to the needs of the Black family. When you think about children who are out on the streets, who polices them mostly? But police officers. You know, we would think in the context of family, it'll be the fathers that discipline them. But it's because of the absence of fatherhood, because of the absence of what we need in the family, what happens is when our kids go on the street, when our mentally ill go into the streets, the family members that we unfortunately reject, they're the ones that are cared for, and not in a good way, by our system. And so this is where we need to make sure that we as a people, and my background is family science, and so I focus largely on Black family, and from a macro level, you know, this is why I chose this work, and this is why this movement resonates with me, and this is why we're out in the community at protests, actually providing case management, working with the homeless youth, making sure they're connected with nonprofits, and to not just say, hey, look, we Black Lives Matter, but also what are we doing to showcase how Black Lives Matter, particularly those that are protesting and disadvantaged on the streets.
Got you. How about you, Jioni?
Yeah, so you know, my company, Thinking Good, focuses on empowering men to be better husbands and fathers. And you know, the story of Thinking Good really is the story of one man who understood that, you know, you only got one chance with each of your kids, right? You know, you got one shot at fatherhood with the kids. And I was definitely afraid that I'd get it wrong, that I wouldn't, get it right. And, you know, this was one assignment that I knew that I couldn't fail. And so, and I remember sitting, I'm in my backyard right now. It looks a little bit different than when I had this conversation, but I remember breaking down on the phone with a friend because I was so afraid that I would fail as a father. And, you know, he said, Jioni, you won't fail because you don't want to fail. You'll make mistakes. We all do. But you're not going to fail. And, you know, as I continue to engage in conversations with other men who are husbands and fathers, and realizing that, you know, I wasn't alone in wanting to succeed, or I should say not wanting to fail as a father, but then also realizing that there weren't any resources, right? I mean, there's no like, how to be a great dad book at, you know, this thing. For those of you who are watching this in 5 years, there used to be a thing called bookstores where you would go and actually buy a book, and you could hold it. So, you know, but I realized that there were other folks who were seeking and searching, and that sort of be able to create, you know, this sort of network. And that's what we do. We tell stories and try to connect people, men mostly, on the issues of being husbands and fathers and being engaged in our kids' lives, whether we're married to the mothers of our children or not. I am, but not everyone is. And, you know, there's a lot of research out there that says that Black men, more than white, Asian, Latino men, are more active in the child rearing activities, whether they live with their mothers, their children or not. So I try not to spend a lot of time trying to dispel myths, because, you know, we know, you know, the reality. Even if a relationship, or even if a dad abdicates his responsibility 9 times out of 10, it's another Black man who steps into the gap. or, you know, a Black woman that's often the case. So that's, you know, thinking good, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But in this current moment, you know, I've been, you know, leading some neighborhood protests, both like literally on the streets in my neighborhood, but also looking to figure out how can we use technology to connect, both in a social justice way, but also in a spiritual and a faith-based way. Uh, and But in terms of like the actual social justice, you know, piece of it, it really started with my children and me sort of thinking about being their father and wanting to be in the streets. And, you know, the younger Jioni would be much more willing to risk getting arrested and being in a position where there would potentially, you know, I could get hurt. Not that I'm out there trying to start something, but I'd be willing to be on the front lines like that. But, you know, I got a family at this particular point in time, and those options to me today aren't the same options that I could pursue, you know, 20 or so years ago. But I felt that I needed to do something, and I needed to honor, um, you know, the questions that my kids were posing. Dad, why would that man put his knee on that man's neck for so long? When he was saying he couldn't breathe and he's crying out for his mom. Dad, why are white people so mean to the Black people? You know, questions that kept me up at night. And even though I say, look, you know, not all white people are evil, but, you know, the Black people, some Black people are hideous, just as hideous to you know, to our own as them. But he says, well, I know, but why are some white people so evil? And, you know, I thought that it was important for them to see their father engaged in some sort of action. You know, we all can't do everything, but we all can do something. And then most importantly, for them to be involved. And over the course of our, you know, protests and demonstrations, I've seen both of my sons' level of confidence, you know, grow in their sense of agency, their sense of, you know, their place in this world. You know, I tell them, well, you can ride outside in the streets, but you can't ride at my dinner table.
Yeah. So Jioni, you know, going back as far as seventh grade, you've been in media, you started the school paper, you started the Olympics at your school. Obviously those are signs of empowerment, initiative, and also execution. Where do those things that are obviously inside of you, right? Where do they come from? Like what's the source of that level of just, you know, getting started, get it done, make it happen no matter what?
Yeah, man. You know, it's interesting. I mean, the quick and easy answer to that is I owe a lot of it to my mom. You know, who used to say to me, Jioni, I don't care what you do. You can be president of the United States, or you can be a garbage man, as long as it's your choice. Um, you know, my father, who I've had an estranged relationship with throughout my life, but he was an entrepreneurial guy. He, you know, was a poet. He always wanted to have a farm, so he would go up to the roof of the house and plant stuff. He sews. Both of my parents, even though they'd been divorced for at least 20 years, at about their bachelor's degrees in their 30s, and then ultimately their both of them are MSWs, Masters of Social Work, and my dad also has a JD. So I was aware of them doing that lifelong learning, even as I was growing up. You know, my family is originally from the Gulf Coast, so from New Orleans to about Beaumont, Texas, I-10. That's where my, you know, most of my family comes from, with the exception of the Palmers, who are from St. Louis. And they left that area, you know, in the 50s in search of a better life, right? Like, so they were willing to leave a place that they had only known for, you know, something new. So I think a lot of that is in my ancestral DNA, right? The idea that you're willing to kind of, you know, to do that. I've always been, my mom has always allowed me to create. You know, we'd make up stuff. You know, we'd make up songs. We'd make up backstories for people that we would see at Denny's. Like, what do you think that guy over there does for a living? Right? No. I think he looks more like a butcher as opposed to an accountant or this and that. So we would, you know, kind of come up with things like that. And then, you know, I'm fortunate enough that I grew up in a town. I grew up, you know, in Berkeley and Oakland, California. The home of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and the Hells Angels.
Yeah.
You know, but it's, you know, it was a place that fostered creativity, entrepreneurship, you know, challenge. You know, you could, if you wanted to, you could. There was a lot that you could do. Now, I mean, there was a lot of freedom, right? I mean, this was the birth of the hippie movement and the free speech movement. So there weren't a lot of the guardrails that, you know, even people my age, I think I'm a little bit older than the two of you guys, but, you know, people my age who grew up in other places, they had many more guardrails on them than we did, you know, in the Bay Area.
Shauntia, talk a bit about what inspired Why Social Work. Like, take us back to the beginning. What prompted you to get this thing off the ground and get it going?
So much of it, again, I talk a lot about my birth mother. Even though my birth mother was incarcerated for much of her adult life and my upbringing, I was raised by a grandmother who is a native of Washington, D.C., but a retired Foreign Service officer. And so one of the best things about, you know, living in her house is when I was first taken into her home, and my brother and I, because I have an older brother, we actually moved around just for 2 years while she went to Rwanda, Kenya, and South Africa during I want to say early to mid 1990s. And so knowing that she was a traveler and did a lot of work with the State Department, even, you know, pushed me to teach Japanese at the State Department once I graduated from high school. I had this sense of international exploration. And it's still core to me right now, because Why Social Work is moving into a platform where we address social justice, not just here in America, but abroad as well. But what really led me to, so knowing that, you know, from the broader standpoint, it's easy for me to take Why Social Work and look at what's going on in Nigeria, South Africa, particularly in South Africa, because there's a lot of similitudes between the Black experience or the Black diaspora and here in America and in South Africa, and also in other countries like Chad. So, in Congo. So one of the things that I have to say was the impetus to the formation of Why Social Work is the Social Worker Reinvestment Act. At the end, when my mom passed, I was a senior at University of Maryland College Park, where I ended up graduating in 2010. And it took me all but a miracle to graduate. I was supposed to graduate in 2009. I had switched my major because I felt in my spirit that something was going to happen. And I needed to be more in touch with my mom and my family and provide those therapeutic services and even advocate for others, because there was a part of me that was just like, this is not right. I was raised to the point where my grandmother would tell me not to pick up the phone when she calls. And it was like she wanted me to live a normal childhood where I did not look at my mom as a black sheep, but kind of figure, oh, I call my grandmother my mother, to almost say the issue doesn't exist. The issue of mental health doesn't exist in this family. The issue of, healing does not exist in this family. The issue of therapy, the issue of good communication, evocative communication when you know that there's a person who's mentally ill within the family environment. But I was told to ignore. And I think that is what I think drives me today and what led to why social work, and then ultimately me changing, in the beginning, changing my major from linguistics and Japanese to family science, because I said, this is not right. I am almost a poster child to the issues of DC as it relates to the crack epidemic. My family is somewhat associated to those incidences, but that's neither here nor there. My mom unfortunately was a casualty to that interaction, so or association, excuse me. So one of the things that I noticed in college is that I needed to change my major again, and when I decided to go from family science graduates as a graduate of University of Maryland College Park, I had to create another pathway to a credential, which at the time was family science. And then I realized family science didn't get me where I need to go as far as availability of social justice. And so then I decided, after getting my first master's in family science, to go into the to apply for admissions into the School of Social Work. And so from there, I realized this is where I was supposed to be with social work, because it's not only the understanding of the person and environment, but there's also that legislative advocacy piece. So when I started school at Catholic University of America, I attended a legislative briefing on Capitol Hill through an organization that focused heavily on the Dorothy Height Whitney Hung Social Work Reinvestment Act. And that Reinvestment Act triggered my experiences wanting to actually move the needle on how social workers respond in moments of crisis. Because it was in that situation in 2019 when my mom passed that it was a social worker that did not inform the family of proper discharge. And so then instead of notifying the family, they actually put the client in in an environment that she had a history of. They put her in, I don't know if you know, a group home in First Street in Ward 5, actually. She died in Ward 5. And so there was a halfway house that was notorious for reentry and recidivism, and they put her right there. And so for a while, I said to myself, you know what, this has to change. And this is an organizational issue. This is a systemic issue. And this is an urgency that I have to subscribe to, because how many people have to fall through the cracks? How many people have to decide that they're worthy of other people's advocacy, of their own advocacy, their own urgency? So there was a bill, Social Work Reinvestment Act, that I pushed. I ended up advocating it for 2 years within the social work profession. And it led to, and under the banner of the social media banner, why social work? Because at that point, we have to remember within our profession why we chose what we chose. We're all products of families. And families are the smallest units of society. So what happens in the family happens in society on a larger scale. The issue, the violence, the issues, the lack of communication, it is incubated by how we respond within our own family context. And so we need to really look at that. And so I said, well, social services is at the heart of families, especially those that are disadvantaged. And so we need to start investing more into the social work profession by way of recruitment, retention, education, workforce improvements, as well as promoting and funding community innovative projects. And so from there, it's like, okay, after kind of stepping back for a while and seeing how the profession will pivot, because the Social Work Reinvestment Act only had a 1% chance of enactment, which is I don't even have to describe how low that is. But of course, it's supported, but, how do we get it so that we actually have tangible results? Because if the absence of safe passage is that we don't have initiative that solely that recruits and retains social workers, we don't have an initiative that promotes the advancement of high schoolers to know more about social work, if we don't provide dual enrollment, if we don't provide workforce relief, if we don't provide entrepreneurial training within our profession that allows social workers to not just go with status quo, but think out of the box in a very entrepreneurial, experiential way, then we're going to do the same thing over and over again with no immediate or long-term change. And so that's where, I've taken my background over the last, in the 10 years of my higher education, I've taken all of those entrepreneurial training and experience into my endeavors in social work through why social work, and it has really created an opportunity for me to say, hey, look, this is not, especially at protests. The most recent one, I can really say, hey, look, I've been at protests all week. I've seen a lot of shit go down, and it's not really, excuse me, I'm sorry, that slipped. It's not really just, being out there and present. While I was walking along Capitol Hill and seeing people talk to and yell at police officers or Capitol Hill officers, there was almost this, I mean, I had an epiphany at that moment, and I thought to myself, I know Martin Luther King has said, I'm a butcher this quote, but he said the language of the riots is the language of the
violence
unspoken.
is the language of the
exposed. Exactly,
unheard.
but protest is the church of the disenfranchised. Because if you think about how they're able to focus on their own self-healing by expressing themselves, Black men, Black women, trans Black, whoever, to be able to express themselves and yell and get all of their frustrations out during a protest, even if they're face to face with a police officer, that is a form of church for some of our people. That is a form of church. And so we need to not look at it as not just a language, but a place of healing and a place of growth and a place of transformation, because right now that is a form of democracy, and that form of democracy is being jeopardized at the hands of the police. And so in our work, in my call to action to other social workers is to go out to protest, to provide de-escalation, to go out and see, are there disenfranchised people that need case management? Because that one precipitating event where one Black male, one Black female died at the hands of the police ultimately perpetuates a large-scale act of violence from the police force that we need to be able to start litigating. And right now, we do not do a good job to protect the people against the same people that we are told is our public safety enforcers. And so there's a lot to be said about how we can look at protests differently. I mean, I'm here in Portland. I'm here in Portland, Oregon, to observe what's going on here. My eyes are a little puffy still, so I'm not just, it's a combination of things, but largely I'm still trying to get my eyes adjusted to what's been going on the last couple of weeks. Just the other night, I didn't have any goggles on, so I'm still kind of adjusting to that. But it's an interesting process, because even here in Portland, the same issues in DC exist. You have, DeVita, who I've been working with very closely, that manned the first aid station right in front of St. John's Church, and worked closely with the Earl's First Amendment Grill, who provided free food in partnership with the first aid humanitarian effort. There was a lot of food that was distributed, a lot of resources, a lot of PPEs. We even have gone to George Washington University to just make sure people were COVID safe. So the same level of public health awareness in DC is very evident of what is going on here. It is very similar to what is going on here. You have the equivalent group, which is Riot Ribs here. So shout out to Riot Ribs. You have Riot Ribs here who have been providing the same level of resources. It's interesting. I mean, they have a whole encampment that was seized today by Portland police, similar to what went down in DC, but it's a very interesting dynamic because of the demographic. I think right now, and I'm going to say this very quickly because I do have the gift of gab, is that, what we see in protests, and what I would say will be the differentiating factor between DC and Portland, and this is why we need more agency within improving our social services, because the people who are sustaining a lot of the protests, who's carrying on a lot of the protests, and this is and no critique to their demonstration of protest, is that they are encamping there because there is nowhere else for them to go. And so that's a problem. And it's a reflection, not only is it a reflection of our police force in that event where someone was killed at the hands of the police force, but it's also a reflection of how our social services responds to the needs of Black people. Because if you look at the demographic of social services right now, it's predominantly African American. And so when I say to social workers, you have to stand up, I don't want to hear that all lives matter. I particularly want to hear, as I respond to social workers, particularly as it relates to social workers for justice, is that I am here, I am present, and I am willing to do this work.
Yeah.
But in our profession, unfortunately, in social work, and this is where we have to just work on it from the top down. We have to get rid of this red tape. You know, our licensure process, everything really stifles innovation. It stifles the ability. Even right now, I'm hearing social workers say, you know, my license might be compromised. So now I'm sending emails to the Department of Social Work and examiners to ensure, to figure out what type of opportunities could provide relief that could be provided, so that there's no reprimand for social workers who get caught up at protests. And we see what happens to medics. We see what happens to medics. We see what happens to journalists, and we see what happens to legal aid. And so this heightens the fear of social workers being on the ground. And we need to provide protections to them just as much as we need to maintain protections of our First Amendment right. But being tear gassed, being arrested, you know, only agitates. When we see bonfires and all this other stuff at protests, that is the exercise of one's emotional distress when they're trying to move the needle on whatever political agenda that is not being met. Now, here in Portland, for an example, it's very evident that the police department and the government has been working and colluding with the federal agents. And it is so unfortunate that it's so performative in our profession, even in our profession, and even in protests as relates to our own advocacy. And there needs to be a lot of reflections on how disingenuous we are at these protests, where we're not addressing the immediate need. We'll say Black Lives Matter and turn around and fetishize our interactions with federal agents, right? We'll yell Black Lives Matter and then fetishize, you know, our relations with Black people by bringing our Black friends to protest, not really understanding what it is to be a Black person. There's a lot to be said and a lot to be learned, a lot of conversations to be had about what it is to be Black. Because right now, when I hear Black Lives Matter, and I'll say this as my closing point, is that what I hear is the 3/5 rule. Is a reminder of the 3/5 rule of a black person, that our lives still matter and that we still are a man. And to that degree, I don't need to be validated. I don't think any other Black person needs to be validated in their existence. But the reality is, it is. We are.
So yeah, you know, can I jump in here real quick? You know, it was interesting. There was a couple of points. I mean, I don't know. I'm pretty sure Silas didn't know most of this stuff, and I let you know, both of my parents are MSWs. I actually got accepted to Catholic's MSW program, you know, 12 years ago, but deferred because I started a new job and I wasn't sure about being in school and working, you know, at the same time. But part of, so I wanted to just kind of see how it would happen, and ultimately decided to wait until I got married and had kids and, you know, manage 40 people and then go back to grad school. But, you know, part of why I was interested in social work was not so much because this is what my parents did, although you made a point about, you know, we should listen to why we choose certain professions or certain careers and whatnot. I would actually amend that to say that we should try to pay attention to why we are called. I mean, sometimes we choose, maybe sometimes it's a proactive kind of thing, but I think that often,
I agree.
You know, to Silas's question about, well, Jioni, why did you were able to do this? I think, well, you know, there's some things that are just in our DNA, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or some things that we may not know it, but that the spirit of the divine is calling us to do or drawing us, you know, nearer, or that sort of thing. So, but what got me thinking about social work and ultimately led to me going to divinity school instead was working on Capitol Hill. And as much as I, you know, enjoyed and learned a lot from that, you know, experience, I felt that I needed to deepen my understanding of some of the issues that were, at play, and also move closer to the people who were most, affected. And it sort of really clicked for me in I worked for the Ways and Means Committee, and there was a subcommittee hearing on like paid family leave or sick leave or something like that. And at some point, like often happens on Capitol Hill, the conversation can devolve into this really wonky policy kind of debate, or a budgetary kind of, debate or conversation about the numbers, without anybody really talking about the people who were most affected by, the single moms or dads, or those types of things. So I was like, I want to kind of work with those people and be closer to that in a way.
So the both of you have been, I guess, so to speak, on the inside, right? Shauntia worked in the State Department. Jioni, as you just mentioned, working closely with folks on Capitol Hill. Do you all consider yourselves to be on the outside at this point? And if so, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And how much of an impact can people have from the outside as well?
If you don't mind, I'll answer this first. One of the interesting things about being at protests and being connected to individuals like yourself, Salas, is that we are able to report to you some of the firsthand encounters of what's going on the ground. And not only were we able to converse with you, we were also able to converse with several other committees and offices on Capitol Hill, to give them a report back to say, this is what happened to protesters, and this is why we need your support. And so, there is a lot of work that could be done, but making sure that you have those allies and spaces and places on Capitol Hill, I think, is just as important, to really kind of translate the demands of demands of protesters, building relationships with those protesters, inviting those protesters to the table. Because oftentimes there are people who, speak for them, but really people don't give them an opportunity to speak for themselves unless they're in a position of a certain status, unfortunately. And so by being able to allow even those who may not be comfortable or even used to talking to elected officials, I think it is so important that becomes a moment where we expand the opportunities of those who want to be able to exercise their voices at different levels, whether it be from the bottom up to all the way to the top. And so I think those opportunities and not even always translating, but just being a person who could bring someone to the table, I think is equally important. And so sometimes you don't really get that flexibility being in, because you spend so much time focusing on the legislation that you don't, in my opinion, that and people are so concerned about clearances and all this, again, red tape, that it becomes a liability versus, okay, you know what, I see this need, let me just be responsive and act, and urgent and act. And so I think, being a nonprofit, particularly a nonprofit leader, that focuses on social justice, or even working collaboratively with 501c4s that lobby, I think you're able to reach multiple audiences at different levels at once, and being able to pivot and being agile from the top down to the bottom up, because that's a skill within itself. Being on the ground and then, hearing and listening, and then, group dynamics, and then moving the needle from the top down as well, and creating that axis, a nexus for people to be able to pivot as well, I think is greatly necessary.
Look, I mean, I'm middle class, college educated, working on my master's degree, have worked on Capitol Hill. Yes, I'm an insider to some extent, but that's relative, right? I think that I have, greater access to local and national and, people in positions of power and authority in a variety of different places. racist, but you know, it's all relevant, right? And so, and I think that every movement needs inside and outside, right? I mean, we're recording this on the day that John Lewis was, you know, laid to rest, right? Well, actually, I should say his funeral in Atlanta. I don't know if the burial took place there or if it's taking place tomorrow or whatnot, but the day of John Lewis's funeral in Atlanta. And, you know, the first 30 years or 20-some years of John Lewis's life, he was an outsider.
Mm.
The balance of his life, he was an insider, right? I mean, even though, like, in one of my, you know, John Lewis is a fraternity brother of mine. He's a Masonic brother of mine. He's somebody who I worked for on the Ways and Means Committee and also worked for when I worked for the Congressional Black Caucus. I had chicken wings with John Lewis. And, you know, he was the youngest speaker at the 1963 March on Washington. And his original speech was censored by the, I believe it was like either the bishop or archbishop of DC at the time, because it was too radical. He talked about, we will march through the South, you know, like Sherman with our own skirt shirt strategy. The black masses are rising up from not only in Philly and Detroit and New York, but in Birmingham and Montgomery and Atlanta and New Orleans. And I mean, it's just fiery militant. It was too militant for, you know, the National Mall on, you know, August 28, 1963. They couldn't do that, right? He calls out, you know, he says, well, the Democratic Party is the party of Hubert Humphrey, but it's also the party of George Wallace. And the Republican Party is the party of Jacob Javits and Barry Goldwater. Where is the party for freedom fighters like us, right? Radical speech. He calls out members of Congress and all this other kind of stuff. But yet 3 years later, John Lewis gets kicked out of SNCC because he ain't radical enough. And Stokely Carmichael comes in, you know, on the Black Power, you know, tip, right? And then Congressman Lewis goes on to, you know, work for some foundations and ends up working in the Carter administration and Atlanta city councilman, and for the last 30 plus years, a member of Congress, right? And, you know, I don't think anyone, you better not come around me saying that John Lewis sold out. But nobody would say that about him, right? I mean, I think that he, you know, was a radical and a revolutionary outside, and he learned how to be a radical and a revolutionary inside, right? So all movements require that, right?
Right.
And sometimes it means somebody stepping from the outside. I mean, stepping from the inside to the outside, or going the other way around. But learning those things, it has to be like that. So, I think that, you know, you can't really, and there are biblical examples. You know, I mean, there's tons of examples of how you need a well-placed person at the right time to move things forward. If Esther wasn't there when Xerxes was being influenced to kind of kill off, you know, the Jews in the book of Esther, her people would have been gone. But Mordecai said, look, don't say nothing until the time is right.
When we talk about the death of John Lewis, well, obviously there's a thought of, you know, who's next. And also when you lose people like that, there's a potential for some people to lose hope, right? Or at least maybe not all the hope, but some of the hope, right? And this work that you all are doing takes a sense of hope. As you mentioned, Jioni, you know, moving from being preoccupied with failure to understanding that mistakes happen, right? And as long as you want to be in it, you know, you'll never fail. How do you all maintain hope for a better country, a better world, given the work that you all are, really immersed in at this point? How do you maintain that hope?
I would say continue being connected with God is definitely something that I have to attribute much of my level of hope with, because I have faith in what is unseen. And so it's so hard, because when you're out at protest and it looks like a war zone, in my spirit, I sometimes I just have to pray in the spirit, because my environment. So often, I just had a conversation with someone just about this morning, in a sense where it's like it's a dichotomy, and oftentimes it's a dichotomy of good and evil, and good and ego, in some regards, however we want to euphemize it. But I definitely feel as though that what we see out here today is only a manifestation of what goes on in the inside of us, what goes on in our spiritual warfare, in our country, and not even only in our country, but also individually. And so being centered and being in the right position on the right side of the chessboard, I think is definitely something that is really, really important to the work that we're doing, because it's so easy. And I'm seeing this oftentimes at protests. It's so easy to be swayed from one direction to the other if we're not rooted in why we're out there. And so, and we all know the biblical significance of being, tossed to and fro. And so I think in that analogy, it's really important to stay rooted in what we believe in. And if our belief is that there is faith in what is unseen, and in our spiritual walk, I think there's nothing that I have done in my walk in this movement that I felt I did in my own might. And I have to say that in totality, because in my entire, between when my mom died, and even quite frankly in my entire life, I can pinpoint where I'm just like, this is no one but God. Because I am just an ordinary person who feels as though that they have been called, to your point, to do this work. Even knowing you, for an example. I mean, we met at church a long time ago. I don't know if you remember, but everything has come back full circle. Where I may have met someone years ago, but then there's a point in time where it becomes, oh yeah, now I see how that person is integral to the direction, not only where I'm going, but also where that person might be going as well. And that is not always for us to know, but to have faith in, because I feel like those who are rooted in the goodness of this fight is definitely one who can walk through all the obstacles that is set forth and know there's no fear in their heart, but the only fear that they have is of God. And so at that point, and I've seen the fearlessness of protesters, but it's also dangerous, because again, if they're not rooted, they're easily pivoted into a direction that could be used or weaponized against them.
So I don't know if you can see right here, there's a little tree.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Japanese maple,
Mm.
which I planted when we moved into this house about 11 years ago. It's not as big as it could be because it's in a pot, so it's limited. Now, the one that I planted in front of my house 11 years ago was maybe like this tall, maybe 3 feet tall. Now it's 9-10 feet tall, provides complete shade and all this other kind of stuff. But recently, we had some work done out here, and this tree was in a much smaller pot.
Mm.
And its roots, and in order to sort of kind of do the work that we were doing out here, we had to move it. And I found out that its roots, that it had busted through the pot and gone into the soil.
Mm.
But in order to move it so that we could do the work, and ultimately so that we could help it to grow, unfortunately, we had to disturb its roots, make it come untethered to the soil that it had grown into. And so we move it, we're doing the work, and over 2 days, all the leaves fall off. You see there's a whole bunch of empty parts where there's no leaves. Now you see some new green stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but there was 3 weeks ago. It was all dead leaves, right? And I didn't want my baby to die. So I'm watering it. I'm talking to it. I'm giving it love. I figure out how to get all the dead leaves off, and I notice that there's some now dead branches, right? I'm doing everything that I can to pray over it. Every limb, I'm praying over it. I'm saying, grow, grow, grow.
Mm-hmm.
And now I got green. I got new leaves. These leaves weren't here, right? That's hope.
Mm-hmm.
That's faith, right? It ain't just like, God, please let these leaves come back. You got to put in some work.
In time.
You got to do something. And my 2 sons know, Daddy might drop dead tomorrow, but we got to take care of this tree.
Mm-hmm.
This is our responsibility. Just like the tree out front, Yoshi, is our responsibility, right? They know, right? So to me, on many levels, I'm not hopeful. I'm very pessimistic about the near future. I mean, we got the president of the United States saying, well, maybe we should cancel the elections right now. We should postpone this, right? I mean,
Right.
only people who, that don't happen.
Right. Yeah.
That only happens in in tenuous democracies, right? I thankfully, like, a lot of the Republican establishment came out and was like, no, this is clear that we're going to do this thing, right? But that whole, that notion. So I'm very pessimistic about the near-term future, next couple of years, because we're dealing with systemic stuff. I mean, we've been in this trick bag for 400 years or more. So it ain't just going to get fixed overnight. But I do believe, and I am hopeful for when my children are my age, that this world is going to be in a much, much better place. But it only will be in a much better place if we are committed to making it a better place today, right now. And that our children know they ain't got no choice but to pick up the baton and run like hell when it's handed to them.
Mm-hmm.
Plain and simple.
Yeah.
And I've already seen it. Literally, I've already seen from that first day when my son and I went out into the streets and protest, and I'm walking in the middle of the street holding up the sign. He's looking at me like I'm crazy. 6 days later, he's leading the protest, telling the police, no, turn this way. We want to go this way. No, go that way. Yeah. So, whether you call protest church or you call it therapy, or you just call it a Pentecostal, praise and worship service. I don't know. It has a power to transform.
It does. And one of the things I wanted to know, I think when you think about the times that we live in today, and I'm not, I want to give this disclaimer, but I was raised Catholic, so I mean, hopefully I'm working on it. But so that was a bad joke. I've been thinking a lot about just the and I'm glad you're on the call because you might be able to speak to this. But I've been thinking in my heart, I've been thinking a lot about Jesus Christ and what it is to be a true Christian, and where do I stand in being a Christian and being Christ-like, being a scribe or a Pharisee. And I'm trying to get to my point where I feel like church is beyond just being within the four walls of people who are hypocrites, quite frankly. And so the reason why I'm saying that is because, we have so many Black churches in Prince George County alone, right? And we have Black churches, prominent Black churches in DC, Virginia, and I've only seen one church march to BLM. And I've seen no churches having church service at a few, very few churches having it, and very few present, but not in so far as a march. And I really think that we've really lost sight of what it is to be a church, and church has no walls. And if that means we're having church by providing some type of advocacy, providing a natural form, and talking about the spiritual underpinnings of what is going on in our society today outside of St. John's Church, then to me, that's church. To me, that is church. To me, it's not about being in the four walls and talking about the people who are on the streets. And I've seen so many people who are trying to determine how people on the street, they're thugs, they're writers, they're everything under the sun except for people who are about social change, or people who do not have the circumstance to move the needle on getting them outside of the streets, off the streets. But they're still willing and have the humility to say, you know what, I'm going to still fight this fight of good faith, no matter how pessimistic I might be regarding the times that we live in today, because I know in my heart, I know I'm called to this because I have a vision. Silas, you read the housing project that I'm trying to do, because I know at the end of the day, what's going on today, housing is going to be the biggest issue within our young folks today, because there's too many of them who are incarcerated, too many of them that are not going to college, too many of them are just in a pathway where they're not going to have what they need. We're going to see if we don't abolish or focus on child welfare in our system, we're going to continue to detain and snatch people away from their families, and which will implode our social service system. And what does that do? It creates a pipeline into homelessness and criminal justice, into the criminal justice system. And so our reality is we can't just say that, Jesus walked with those who went to church. He walked with those that were considered the least of these, those who are disabled, those who are criminals, because the people that I know out there, they have records. The people that I know out there, they pay child support. The people I know out there are orphans. The people I know out there in DC, they're the ones that are fighting the good cause of fight every day, and even if that means occupying H Street. But as far as I'm concerned, individual, I know we're recorded, so I'm not going to put people's name out there because I don't want this to be an issue in the future. But I know people who are in leadership in the District of Columbia are not sympathetic to the needs on the street, because if that was not the case, they would have warned people before throwing their property, all the belongings that they have to DDOT. And I think that is ridiculous. And so my organization had to come out of our pocket close to $2,000 plus to make sure they had a hotel to shower and everything else. Where are social services then? And so when we want to be empathetic, we be empathetic to things that are personal to us, not empathetic to the things that are happening to people who are non-personal to us, who are strangers.
So,
and that to me is Christianity.
Yeah, amen. You opened up a can of worms, and we can be here for a very long time with a lot of theological conversations and the history of Christianity, and all of this other kind of stuff. But what I will say is I agree with a lot of your critique about faith institutions. I do know of churches that have been engaged, and I know that my members of my congregation, including clergy, and I go to Metropolitan AME, which is around the corner from the White House, participated in our family, friendly protest. The benediction to one of our, protests was given by our executive minister, Reverend Moya Harris. I know that people from the Howard University School of Divinity, where I attend, have been present, as well as people from, lay and not clergy, but a number of different organizations that I know through sort of faith organizations and institutions, as well as Howard University faculty and alumni who have participated in some of our virtual stuff. So it's there, but I do think that moments like this are when we see what Jesus people follow.
Mm-hmm.
Because we like to talk about Jesus as a singular individual. And Jesus was a singular individual. But there are some people, when they talk about Jesus, they talk about Jesus, Jesus who is saving souls in the afterlife. Not the justice Jesus who is looking to save lives in the here and now. Right? So, me, right, when I think of Jesus, right, I think of somebody who rose up a movement. Right? I think of Jesus in the same way that I think of Moses, who said, "Nah, Pharaoh, let my people go. My people come. Let's go." He's an organizer, right? Moving, people in a certain direction. When I think of Jesus, I think of Jesus who, at the Last Supper, took off his robe and put on an apron and washed everybody's feet and said, "Look, this is what it means to be my disciple, to be in service of others. And I call you, I'm giving you a new mandate, a new commandment, which is to love one another as I have loved you," right? It's also the same Jesus who taught us a new prayer, which said, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So a lot of people like to forget about that on earth piece and just think about the heaven piece. Because if it's supposed to happen on heaven, in heaven, why then we are obligated. Let me repeat. We are obligated to make sure that it happens here on earth.
Yes.
So that's the Jesus that that I think of, right? And there are a lot of most churches you go into, the demographic is a little bit older. It tends to be more women than men. There aren't a lot of 20 and 30 somethings, whatever. I mean, they might be there on homecoming Sunday or Mother's Day, Christmas, whatever, when they're obligated to do. So there are some some challenges there. And there are some issues with finances and all this other kind of stuff, just the way that it happens. But I do think that one of the things that I know that our church, we're online. We're doing the virtual type thing, both with our Sunday worship services, but also our Wednesday noon and Wednesday night Bible study. I'm going to be jumping off at 7:00 to do vacation Bible study online. Which, if it was in person, I might not be able to do it, right? So it's given me that opportunity, not just me, but also my kids, and we're on together at the same time. Then we go to breakout rooms for 30 minutes, and then we all come back together. So it's kind of cool. But one of the things that I've been doing, and to your point about church beyond the walls, right, is since March 28th, which is about 1 month after my grandmother died, we've been having a Saturday night family and friends prayer and reflection call. 9 p.m. Eastern on Zoom, where we come together. And it started off with just like my sort of immediate family, so that we could mourn and celebrate my grandmother a month after she died, a month into COVID, when we can't be with each other when we would want to be with each other. Every Saturday, except for one Saturday when we were out of town at a place with no Wi-Fi, we've done this, right? And I've worshiped, fellowship, commune with friends and family that I haven't worshiped, fellowship, and commune with in 20 years. Some whom I've never worshiped, with. And every week, and well, we have a kind of a regular crew now, but most weeks there's often somebody new. So people who come to this thing are always worshiping and fellowshipping and communing with people that they don't know.
That's awesome.
They only know through this type of thing, right? And so this is an opportunity for us, and I think we can all lead in our own way. And for me, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call it protest, but this is another response to how we can create community, both in the time of crisis, but also in this new age that we're in.
So you all talked a lot about, from my perspective, just listening, there has to be a fresh start, or at least fresh additions to how we look at faith, how we look at the organizations that support the faith and beliefs that we have. And I can't help but think about family. Shauntia, you talked about those without family using these opportunities to create their own families, right? Jioni, you talked about the roots of your trees and your plants, and having to disturb and to some degree disrupt the normalcy that they
cause trauma.
Yeah, cause trauma, right? For the sake of starting anew. And then in both of your lives, you all talked about breaches with respect to parental involvement or the lack thereof. And the Black nuclear family, I want you guys to kind of talk about the importance of that. Is it important? And more importantly, the importance of creating new traditions and new legacies within Black families.
That's a good question. And I would have to say that is actually a difficult question, because there's so many variables that go into the Black family now, and there's a lot of distrust within our Black community to be able to have a starting point on how to respond to this question. And I would have to even say this, right? Even tying into the protest, there's a lot of views on what BLM looks like, right? The perspective of BLM is just different across communities, right? And I feel like similar to that, the definition of family varies across communities and within the Black community. And it's hard to even say, because, I feel like a independent Black woman will look at a family very different than a grandparent who raised their grandchildren, right? And the reason why I'm saying this is because this is, and maybe I'll just defer before I think about this a little more, is because how my grandmother raised me as a single woman is very different than how the single parents are being children are raised by single parents today. Younger single parents, not just, and single parents in general. And so I think that there's a huge clash within the Black community that first needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, fortunately, depending on which perspective you look at it on, I definitely think church is at the heart of it. And among the older generation, but then when you look at the younger generation, they're more spiritual than religious. And so this is a very loaded question to ask, Silas. So because there's so many variables to it, that our society is so divided within, let alone our society, but when in respect to the Black church, the Black family. Now we're having a conversation around what does LGBT look in the Black community, and there's resistance even within that movement. So it's really hard to say, as it relates to, in my opinion, as it relates to the Black family, what does traditions look like? Because I think that will be respective or relative to what the intersecting factors of how that person subscribes to how they identify within society. It's so hard to pinpoint. And even as a religious person, as a person who believes in Christ and want their walk to be reflective of Christ on earth, it's even hard to even have a conversation around religion, because people don't subscribe to Christ anymore. They don't subscribe to religion anymore, or organized religion. So I'm going to say that I don't know if I can answer that question, even though my background is family. It's just too many variables at play in our society, particularly as a social worker, that we have to be sensitive and competent of, that it's really hard to pinpoint, even within our community, because our community is so unfortunately distrusting towards each other. which you can see the cascading effect of how we communicate in our relationships with each other. Hence the reason why so many communities have high domestic violence rates. It's really hard for us to, that's going to be, I think the faith community needs to come together on that, not government.
So
to figure out what that looks like.
So I'm gonna try to run through a couple of things real quickly here and whatnot. But first of all, I just want to say that this notion of like a social justice Jesus, right? Like, it's been there. It's always been there, and I would argue that that is what attracted our formerly enslaved ancestors to Christianity.
I agree.
Because they heard a message of liberation.
Exactly.
They saw Jesus as a brother who was speaking out against the master class of his time, and he was organizing people who looked like them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So that's why. But for the 200 years prior to our ancestors, roughly 200 years that they've been in this country prior to them embracing Christianity, when they were put on those ships on the west coast of the African continent and traveled the Atlantic, they were experienced a different type of baptism. But when they got on those ships, they weren't Christians. They didn't know who Jesus was the way that we may think we know who Jesus was. Like, they were Igbo, they were Muslim, they were Yoruba, they were Ashanti, they were Akan and whatnot. They had different spiritual traditions, although there's some commonalities across them, but they were different. They spoke different languages. They were organized politically very differently. Clans, some had come from empires, some came from very small villages and whatnot. But when they were on those ships and on those slaveholding properties, they knew that it was about survival, justice, and freedom. And all of the insurrections that we know about, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Proctor, Stono's Rebellion, you had a Christian minister, you had an imam, you had an African conjurer, you had men, women, different ethnic groups, all united for the struggle for survival, justice, and freedom, right? So I offer all of that to say is that while, you know, there are a lot of differences or whatnot, but a black man with a PhD and a brother who didn't, you know, graduate from college, or a sister with an MD and a, you know, 16-year-old single mom, on a lot of public opinion polls on issues, they are not that far apart. They just aren't. And the reason why my son has a mohawk, or I should say why I let him get a mohawk, he decided to get it on his own. But the reason why I let him get a mohawk is because I realized it didn't matter whether or not he had on a three-piece suit and it was a clean cut. If he went to the store to get a bag of Skittles and an Arizona iced tea, and he encountered George Zimmerman, it didn't matter if his daddy has a PhD or his mama has an MD or a JD. Does not matter, right? So again, yes, there are some issues and there are some challenges, and I'm not trying to paint a picture that it's Shangri-La and that everything is all good within the Black community and that we are all on one accord. We definitely have challenges, but I reject the notion that what divides us or what we differ on are greater than that which unites us. And I would also finish by this last point that I would argue that religious independence, denominational independence, Black Catholic churches, Black Baptist churches, Black Methodist churches, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Church of God in Christ, the formation of those were the first freedom and independence movement of our people in this country. And that's the reason why our churches are attacked. Come on, if Dylann Roof wanted to kill Black people, he could have killed a lot more Black people if he went down to the club than if he went to the basement of Mother Emanuel Church. He could have found a park in North Charleston and lit up a couple of brothers.
Right.
There is a reason why he went to Mother Emanuel, the mother church of the AME church in the South.
Mm-hmm.
He might not have known, but somebody said, if you're going to do this, this is where you go.
Exactly.
There is a reason why black churches are burned.
Yep.
They ain't burning black jig joints.
I agree.
They ain't burning black illegal gambling spots.
Right.
And we know
Because they perpetuate it.
that the grand dragon of the Georgia Ku Klux Klan was the head of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. So he knew where all the vice spots were, but they weren't blowing up those spots. They were blowing up churches. Why is that?
Yeah. Man,
I'm sorry. One of the things I just wanted to add to your point is, I don't think I'm disputing that we have a common goal, right? I think everyone in the Black community are aligned with the fact that we are oppressed. And I think, no matter what the issue is, it's still a level of oppression that we all agree and identify with. But what I'm saying, unfortunately, is how we respond to that oppression varies, unfortunately, sure, which determines our family interaction. And you have to say the pulse and the temperature. Unfortunately, the temperature in our families are hot, and not in a good way. And it's fragile. Our families are fragile. Our families are disjointed. And our families need healing. And so with that said, and hence the reason why you have high domestic rates in DC, high domestic rates in Prince George County and the metropolitan city alone, because of violence in the home, it only exacerbates violence in the community. And so it's one of those things where I feel like, granted, we identify with oppression, it's how we respond to it that is detrimental to the health and safety of our own community. And that's where we need to have a very critical lens about how we address, like you had mentioned earlier, and I'm glad you said that. And to go back to your analogy of trauma, how do we address trauma? When you know something is dead, and our families, I'm not saying our families to the extent to which they need resuscitation because they're dead, but to some extent they're not thriving either. Right? Many of them are not healthy, and we can't look at the middle class family and say, that is the Black family. And I get it. There's a lot of affluency, but then there's a lot of poverty as well. So one of the things that I really want to make the point of is that when we make that transition, or if we know that, our families are to the point of desolation, we need to be able to make sure they understand that trauma could be healthy if it's responded in an appropriate way. If we're tendering the soil so that we know that there's going to be growth, there's going to be greenery, we're watering our children, we're giving them what they need in schools, we're giving them what they need in order to prepare themselves for education. Because what I see in schools, in DC public charter schools, is an avoidance to learn, because at the end of the day, learning is not culturally accepted in the inner city, is because so until we get to the point where it's culturally accepted to be educated, not just in the middle class, but in urban America, that is urban Black America, I think that's where we get to the point where we are addressing a lot of things. Because unfortunately, the single mom who didn't go to college, she's unfortunately, they may say, I want my child to go to college, but there's an underlining issue of contention if that child says they're going to college. And I think we have to start addressing that. And Salas, you may know what I'm talking about when I say that. They have good faith in their children, but they don't want to see their children exceed as far as what they've done. And we need to seriously be intentional about it, because I'm not hopefully you don't look at this as an attack, but unfortunately our Black churches are not the same as what they were in the 1960s. And I'm not saying technology's changed, everything has changed, so there shouldn't be stagnation, but the reality is I don't know what direction it has gone, because we're looking at prophetic churches as our culture looks at prophetic churches as a way of the new way of Tinder. It's the way we look at church is very, or the younger generation is some of the same behaviors that they, like you just mentioned, at a Jew joint, they're doing at churches now. And we know some of those churches that they're doing it at. right here in the DC metropolitan area. So it's one of those situations where in order for us to change, I really feel in order for us to change the culture within the Black community, we have to be very critical of how we make that transition from one pot to the other. And right now we're not having a conversation on that transference of trauma to be able to make sure that our families thrive at the end of the day. And until we have that conversation, we will never be able to have the thriving families, because when I go to DC, I think of the Black Wall Street in some communities. With Durban, North Carolina, still some remnants of the Black Wall Street. So it's like, where can we get to the point where our families first, then our communities are thriving? And that needs to be looked at in that way at the micro level before we can make macro change.
I mean, I definitely look. I mean, I'm not. I don't want to paint like this Pollyannish view of the Black community where it's all harmony and it's all peace and love and all this other kind of stuff. And they're definitely real and legitimate issues that we need to work through and embrace more openly and willingly the diversity, within our community. But I would argue that by and large, the Black church is the preeminent Black institution, independent Black institution in our in America. I mean, with the exception of private HBCUs, maybe that are independent.
Right.
HU, baby, HU. I'm sorry, Hampton Institute. My bad. I was thinking of that HU, not the Mecca, because that's federally sponsored to some extent.
Right.
It's like public-private, but so I mean, I think that often as a community, because we are so traumatized, to use your word, that we're often harder on ourselves than we actually really need to be. I don't know. I mean, I just feel like, yeah, there's challenges and a lot of, and that's a problem with a lot of institutions. And I mean, if you go back to the 50s and the 60s, right? Like the John Lewis generation, right? And we think about John Lewis, who also was a minister. We think about Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and Fred Shuttlesworth, and all of those folks. We think of that as a movement that was led by African-American faith leaders, right? Black faith leaders. When in fact, they were outcast in their, among their religious colleagues. The letter to both Black and white, the letter to the Birmingham jail, one of, Dr. King's most famous written pieces, was written to moderate white clergy who was saying, slow down, right? So we like to mythologize like that, this sort of thing. But part of the reason why is these folks came up in churches, and I forget the name of it, but there was a sociological study of churches and Black churches in the 30s and the 40s. And what we realized is that many of these young people who ultimately became to, lead social protest movement, they had more education than some of the ministers. Right? I mean, not a lot of, I happen to be a member of a denomination that requires a bachelor's degree to become an ordained deacon and an MDiv in order to become, an elder or, to be able to lead a pastor to lead a congregation. So, but a lot of, you don't need that for a lot of other places, a lot of other denominations. So in many respects, sometimes I mean, we often think of the shepherd leading the flock, but sometimes members of the flock end up having to lead, the shepherd in the congregation, right? And I think that rather than, and now we have a lot of there are a lot of I mean, I got vacation Bible study vacation Bible school in 20 minutes, right? There are a lot of other things that I could be doing on a Thursday night. I mean, I'm not a big NBA guy, but you know what? I'm kind of halfway interested in watching the first NBA game tonight.
Right.
Just, like I could, I could see doing that, but I'm, want to be here and have this particular experience. So I think that, like, often we lament, and this, I think, gets back to the whole, how do you stay hopeful, question, which could also be the legacy question. It could be the how do you stay committed kind of question. I mean, often, we throw up our hands in frustration and like, oh man, this is just my grandma's thing or whatever. I don't see myself there. But, the church has only sustained itself because it has innovated. Right? I mean, do you think the Catholic Church would be the Catholic Church today if everybody still had to sit and listen to Mass in Latin?
Right. And I understand that. One of the things that, I guess one of the core reasons why I'm saying that there is something missing within our community to question, to Silas's point about trust and traditions and relationships, is that we're losing trust in our community. Right? We have this we need to restore trust, because if we don't have trust, then we can't necessarily buy Black businesses. If we don't have trust, we can't necessarily go to the Black church. We can't go to the historical Black college and university because we don't have trust in those Black systems. We can't have healthy relationships because we don't trust our own our partner, our husband, our spouse, our whoever we're in a relationship that look like us. And so we need to move away from prophetic notions that solves our problem to more of how do we regain trust in the Black community before we even get to the whole, we need white people to trust us or we need other cultures to trust us. We just need to trust ourselves. And I think that's where what I'm trying to say is that trust is lacking. And that is, I feel, once we get to the point where we can trust one another, we can trust our institutions, we can, and that's including banking, education, higher education, everything, housing, people, housing market, whatever. I know some people who I've even heard one person say, I don't buy from Black, even in the housing market. If I only buy from white people. So I think I'm not saying, but I'm just saying that we have to, if we want to talk about traditions and how we support each other, I think that goes back to, and I think I'm answering the question that you had mentioned earlier, Silas, we have to start addressing the issue of trust, which is the foundation of our existence in humanity.
So I know that,
because that's the first thing you learn when you how you trust your caregivers. And so and that goes all the way back to infancy. If we don't trust our caregivers, it's going to be hard to trust anyone else moving forward.
Yeah. So, wait, Jioni.
I mean, I don't know. I just last fall, almost a year ago, I was leaving the house at around 9:30 to go meet up with some friends over on like North Capitol in Rhode Island, and as I'm literally reaching for my doorknob, I heard a knock on the door. So I opened it. I'm thinking there's one of my friends showing up to pick me up because he heard that I was going to be walking over there, and I see this young brother who's a junior or senior at Howard. I ended up checking, but he's like, "Hey, can I use your phone?" Right? And I'm like, "Whoa, who? What's going on here?" And the dude was blackout drunk. And you can get blackout drunk where you don't know what's going on, right? I mean, he just said, "I don't know, I was just drinking tequila, whatever." And he somehow got disconnected from his friends and was trying to get to his house. I'm trying to help him. He wanted to come in, but I'm like, I'm not letting, I got my kids and my wife upstairs. But let's sit here on the porch. I'm going to get you some water, and I'm going to try to help you figure out, right? I saw his ID, his school ID, his driver's license. And it turns out he only lived like 3 blocks away from me on 3rd Street. But I'm sitting there, and I asked him, And this dude is, I mean, he's stone cold, like in a total blackout, scenario. I said, "Why'd you knock on my door?" He said, "I was just hoping a black person would answer and would help."
I'm sorry?
I was just hoping a black person would answer and you would help me. This guy was blackout drunk, but he was black enough to know his odds were better with me than with somebody else.
Yeah.
Right? So I know we got a lot of trauma. I know we got a lot, we got a lot of, we got a lot of issues, but I'd be willing, but
No, that's true.
I don't think anyone on my block would have done their brother any harm, but I don't know if anybody else on my block would have gone to his house every day for the following week to check up and to see how he was.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, I mean, our trauma is real. I get it, but I also get that and whether we want to acknowledge it explicitly, but implicitly, we all know we in this thing together.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, the only reason I'm saying that is because it's not that for a fact. There's layers. I feel like there's also layers to it, right? Like we know we're going to support each other in a situation where when there's an other, or when there's opposition, right? We gravitate to ourselves. But on the day-to-day, I think that's where we become challenged with the notion of trust. Because if you think about on the metro, for an example, I know people who will look at or have seen a person that looks disheveled, and all of a sudden they start clutching their purse. They start clutching, whatever belongings they have on them. And it's not that the person who is perceived to be a theft or perceived to be a criminal, but it's just based on how they look. And so one of the things I wanted to pinpoint is, and I see this a lot in the public charter school system, is that the value of trust, we see our youth see so much corruption. They see that they have to survive. They get their needs met, however way possible. And so, unfortunately, in that regard, there's a lack of value and trust, right? Because at that point, it becomes exploitive. So what I'm saying, what I'm really trying to stress here is that, unfortunately, and when we see this because of how we interact with each other as a social worker, there are more domestic violence cases within this metropolitan area than any other. So I'm sorry, I have to say we do not trust each other to the point where we can trust each other in our own relationships and within our own community. Because if that wasn't the case, we would not see community violence. We would not see our level of homelessness on our streets, because at the end of the day, we don't trust that there's a story behind that person, and it's not just because of whatever the case might be. Yeah. And so, drugs or whatever, he's just, he's just trying, whatever the case, whatever. Because when I walked down, and just to bring it back to BLM, when I walked down BLM and I saw people, with their cameras looking at the homeless population who were protesting outside of St. John's Church, there was no questions asked. It was a default assumption that at the end of the day, whatever their reason are for being out there, it was their reason for being out there. And I don't want to put anyone's words in anyone's mouth, but there was no question, no conversation. I've seen people with all types of fraternity shirts, HBCU shirts on their person, but neither one of them. It pained me to see people from our own Black community that supports our own Black community, but as long as it's middle class, they won't have any conversations with anyone else within the community that is the most disenfranchised.
Yeah,
that exists.
Silas, I know you're probably trying to wrap us up here, or trying to, bring it back together here, but I just wanted to say something to that last point, right? And there's a story in the book of John, I believe it's chapter 9, where Jesus heals a blind man. He and his disciples are traveling, and they encounter a blind man, and one of the disciples says to Jesus, "Rabbi," upon seeing the blind man, "who sinned? His parents, or did he sin?" Right? Because there has to be a reason why this man is blind.
Right.
Either his parents sinned or he sinned, because that's the only reason why somebody would be blind. That's the only reason somebody would be poor. Is because they sinned. The only reason why somebody would be, well, why do they not have health care? Why are they addicted to drugs? Why are they in jail? Did their parents sin? Is this an ancient curse? Or is it something that these licentious and lascivious people did that brought the wrath of God on them? And Jesus said, nobody sinned. Nobody did. You know, and in fact, so Jesus spits in some dirt and turns it into mud and puts it on the man's eyes and tells the man to go to this particular pool and wash it off. And then the man has sight. And then ultimately, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the establishment wants to condemn Jesus for conducting a miracle on the Sabbath. Right? So, two things that I take away from that story. One, if that man didn't go and wash off his stuff in the way Jesus told him to do it, he wouldn't have, he potentially would still be blind, right? So that speaks to how we are in partnership with God, right? We have to do our part. That's what a relationship is, right? But ultimately, my takeaway is that the system, those people in power and ideology of privilege and authority is what ultimately failed that man, right? Because they saw his affliction as, well, something that he did, not that he was underserved. Right. So, and I offer that up not just because of scripture, but we see that every day, right? We think that, oh, well, if, you know, you have good health and wealth, it's because God is blessing you.
Right.
But if God is blessing you with good health and good wealth, you don't even have to say it. But it is implied that the absence of good health and wealth is because you do not have God's favor. And I reject that theology.
So I know that we've had like a really, really great discussion, and I've just been sitting here like in amazement, you know, watching you guys talk a lot about the things that have been on my mind. And, you know, I've had conversations myself with faith leaders about where the faith community fits into responding to social injustice. I've also had many discussions about family and trust. So to hear you all talk to the degree that you have about these things, I think is important. And the way I want to wrap this thing up is by saying that, Shauntia, to your point about trust, I feel like each day we have the ability, whether we know it or not, to take small steps to build that trust. I think the three of us on this conversation, all of us displayed a level of stepping out on trust, right? You guys did not know each other before this, right?
Right.
You didn't know who you were going to be talking to, right? You got a brief bio on one another, but other than that, you didn't know, right? I had to have trust that this conversation would be a fluid conversation, and it ended up being that, right? And then more importantly, I think, I don't know what happens from here for the three of us, if there's a synergy to work on something a decade from now or 2 months from now or tomorrow, right? But there's a level of trust that we all stepped out on, that there's a possibility that the three of us could put our minds together and make a difference. So my suggestion to those that are watching this conversation, and even to those of us involved in the conversation, is that, trust is not something that we have to look at as jumping off a cliff, but just taking that one step. And, the one step will lead to a second and to a third and to a fourth. And I think if we show small examples of moving toward trusting one another, we can set examples for others to do the same. So that's the real purpose of this whole concept, is that there's too many people in proximity of one another that don't know one another, that should know one another. And with that, man, I'm glad that we had this discussion. I'm thankful to the both of you and very appreciative to the both of you for giving your time to be a part of this. I'm calling it an experiment. I don't know where it goes completely from here, but I'm hoping that, at the end of this, more people will be connected and able to work together. So Again, much appreciation to the both of you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and looking forward to, working continuously with the both of you as well.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Reverend Palmer. I mean, I
Yeah.
thoroughly enjoyed this conversation here, theological breadth of just knowledge regarding whatever issue I presented. So thank you so much for giving me an understanding of your work.
Yeah, no, well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, and I enjoyed having this, this conversation, and hopefully, we can talk. And actually, I'll follow up. I got something that actually is in conversation. I have a proposal that's in conversation with some of the things that we've been talking about.
That sounds good.
So yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, definitely.
Well, good stuff. For those that have been watching, I hope you all enjoyed the conversation. And please look forward to more conversations like this. Again, Jioni, Shauntia, thank you guys for your time.
Thank you.
And we will talk soon. And with that, good evening, everybody.
Bye.